So we have a few new details that have come out regarding the mysterious death, supposedly, of Jeffrey Epstein. And these are being reported in the New York Times. Now, first of all, it's instructive to note how the New York Times has decided to modify or modulate its language when discussing this death. And here's exactly how they phrase their latest report. Quote, Jeffrey Epstein, the financier who apparently hanged himself in a federal jail in Manhattan, was supposed to have been checked by guards every 30 minutes, but that procedure was not being followed the night before he was found, a law enforcement official with knowledge of his detention said. Now, the new detail reported having to do with the procedure not having been followed is obviously notable in its own right, but also take notice of the new qualifier word added by the New York Times, apparently hanged. So they're not simply repeating the claims of the officials anymore who have been promulgating this news that Epstein hanged himself. And just by the addition of that one word, you can tell that the skepticism of the very timeline that has been put forward to the public is now being viewed by the New York Times with skepticism. So, given that the New York Times is now incorporating that skeptic qualifier into its own coverage, is a cue that the rest of the media will now be doing the same. And I think that's at least in part a response to the widespread incredulity across party lines yesterday about the official narrative of the story that was put forward. There hasn't really been a fully formed official narrative put forward yet, but people at the very least were intensely doubtful that this could have just been some banal, coincidental lapse of judgment by the federal jail officials, which led to Epstein being able to commit suicide. And the New York Times reflects that. But take a look at what also they have now reported. Epstein was supposed to have been checked by guards every 30 minutes. But suddenly that procedure was not being followed the very night before he was found dead, reportedly. Now, we knew that Epstein had been taken off suicide watch just 2 weeks after he purportedly made a suicide attempt, although there are differing details as to whether what he did in July was actually a suicide attempt. Other reporters of some repute have cast doubt on whether the incident where Epstein had bruises on his neck was conclusively determined to have been a suicide attempt. The Carol Lonig, who I mentioned yesterday, reported that Epstein had told associates that he had in fact been attacked. Now, maybe Epstein is just a liar, or Lonig got some bad information. Whatever the case may be, according to this reporter, Epstein had told authorities that someone tried to kill him in that previous incident. Therefore, not a suicide attempt. Maybe it was a suicide attempt and Epstein was simply trying to cover his tracks. Whatever. But at least there's some doubt as to the veracity of the initial portrayal of that incident. So at the very least, any person with common sense would have expected Epstein to be under the most intensive scrutiny possible for any federal inmate. This facility, the Metropolitan Correction Center in Lower Manhattan, is known to be among the most stringent federal facilities in the entire country. So much so that an inmate who had been housed both at the Metropolitan Correctional Center and Guantanamo Bay characterized Guantanamo as, quote, more relaxed and more pleasant than this particular federal jail. And the inmate who relayed that was Ahmed Galani, who was convicted of conspiracy in relation to the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. So this was somebody who had some affiliation with Al-Qaeda and was convicted of conspiracy to carry out attacks which led to 224 deaths. And this person had related that he had a much easier time of it in Guantanamo than the MCC. So this idea that there would have just been some random oversight at the MCC with regard to the most high-profile prisoner, arguably, that they had at the moment, of course that's going to strain credulity, and of course that's going to give rise to reasonable skepticism. This is the same facility that had previously housed people like John Gotti and Bernie Madoff, Omar Abdel Rahman, who was known as the Blind Sheikh and was convicted with regard to a conspiracy for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. You have El Chapo was housed there. So there were incredibly high-profile people housed at this particular facility. So obviously they have protocols in place to deal with that, including on weekends when jails of this kind do tend to be less staffed. But nonetheless, the idea that that would give an opening to somebody like Jeffrey Epstein to suddenly kill himself after he had attempted, or may have attempted, just a week and 2.5 weeks prior. I think the notion that you're crazy to look askance at that timeline of events is unto itself crazy. I mean, obviously, people are not going to accept that without a definitive investigation establishing what exactly happened here. But the basic point is that the New York Times is now also projecting a posture of skepticism toward the federal officials' narrative here. And that tells you pretty much as conclusively as anything that there is still much more to be understood about what transpired. The New York Times further reported that the decision to take Epstein off of suicide watch and house him alone in a cell just 2 weeks, shortly after he had committed the potential suicide attempt, also violated the jail's normal procedure, according to two officials who spoke to the New York Times. So we're supposed to believe that two major procedures were just coincidentally violated in relation to the most high-profile criminal, potentially in the entire U.S. carceral system at this point. We're supposed to believe that those lapses were just random. I don't think most people of reasonable disposition tend to buy that. And so, I think people are going to be arguing about this death for maybe the rest of our lives. It's going to be one of those events that people are just never satisfied with the official explanation for. And it should be said that we still don't have really a comprehensive official investigation. But there are so many details which should occasion justified skepticism, including the fact that there have been no recorded suicides at this facility in at least the recent past, according to, anyway, two prosecutors who worked for the SDNY, Southern District of New York, which has jurisdiction over this facility. So here's what Ellie Honig, one of the prosecutors, said yesterday. Quote, "I worked at SDNY for 8+ years. Collectively, the office had thousands of defendants housed at MCC during that time. I could be overlooking one, but I can't recall any suicides in MCC during that time." Lots of questions, he adds. And another prosecutor for the SDNY chimes in. By the way, it's amazing how all these SDNY people have gotten like major media platforms and are now like CNN commentators and everything, because everybody thought that the SDNY was going to be the place where Trump was going to be taken down as a result of kind of these external criminal investigations that were farmed out by Mueller. And of course, that didn't happen. They closed the investigations without anything really directly implicating Trump, aside from potentially Michael Cohen's claims that there was a campaign finance violation that Trump directed. But anyway, that's a side note. Another legal genius from the SDNY weighs in, named Mimi Roca, and says, "No, I don't recall one either. Apparently, absolutely have seen defendants, targets who committed suicide, but usually when at home or about to be apprehended. At a federal facility like MCC, she knows they are not common." So maybe there was a suicide in the past that occurred at this location, but the people who would have the most direct knowledge of that don't seem to be aware of any prior examples. So maybe Epstein managed to get away with one last act which circumvented all the normal protocols, but that would be pretty darn interesting if he did pull that off. So don't buy in to journalists or pundits or whatever chastising you for having this kind of instinctive skepticism of an event like this, given the outstanding issues that have not yet been addressed, given the myriad powerful players involved who would have had a direct interest in potentially seeing to it that Epstein's life did not continue. Obviously we can't make a definitive conclusion one way or another yet, but we can say with pretty much absolute certainty that the initial skeptical impulse is more than warranted. And that was verified just this morning by the New York Times, who obviously are also skeptical given that qualifier that I noted, where Epstein's death is now being termed an apparent suicide rather than just a suicide. So even the New York Times, the arbiter of all that is right and just in the world and fair, etc., they are now saying it was only an apparent suicide. So just want to give you a brief update on that. And I think that people should not be browbeaten into thinking that they are somehow the crazy ones if they don't automatically believe every story that is being pushed out by the federal law enforcement authorities, because you have other authorities and other positions of power, such as the New York Times and elsewhere, confirming that skepticism is justified. All right, I'll take a couple of questions here. or comments, trolling attempts, etc. Somebody asks, is it possible he wasn't killed and we're just being told he was? Anything is possible. I mean, there ought to have been video available. And I saw somebody who was basically just doing a disinformation tweet storm yesterday, quote, report that the video cameras have been turned off. That hasn't been confirmed. It's possible that they were turned off, but we just don't know yet. But theoretically, there should be conclusive evidence one way or another of how exactly his death occurred. And so, I wouldn't rule out any possibility given his connections and given what he could have used his vast wealth to facilitate. But still, you should be tethered to the empirical reality and to the facts. And if you're not, if you get ahead of yourself in that regard, if you become overly speculative and overly blatantly conspiratorial, that's when you give the journalistic authorities and the political authorities an excuse to dismiss all skepticism as somehow unfounded. So just try to approach stuff with a skeptical eye, but insist that it be on a foundation of facts and reason and logic rather than whatever you think that the most nefarious and even maybe like perversely entertaining explanation may be. Do you think he may have just paid off the guards so they would let him kill himself? Again, that's a plausible explanation that, for example, Bill Barr seemed like he has every intention to look into when he said that he was appalled yesterday by what took place. It's not uncommon in the slightest for guards to be involved in all kinds of corruption, whether it's smuggling, whether it's turning a blind eye at key junctures so that inmates can beat somebody up or even kill somebody. I mean, this is a well-documented history. You do have to immediately look to the guards. And if a guard actually did help facilitate that and they thought they were going to get away with it with such a high-profile prisoner whose every financial transaction is now being deeply examined by God knows how many law enforcement and journalistic sources, then that guard was out of his or her mind, because that is almost inevitably going to come out at some point. Somebody notes, I won't believe he's dead until I see a picture of his body, maybe. Now, there was a photo of him that was in the New York Post yesterday that did appear to show him deceased laying on a gurney being wheeled out. It's just one photo. Obviously, you'd want an autopsy. I saw reports today that there was an autopsy that was supposed to come out today, which would be a quick turnaround for an autopsy. My understanding is those usually take quite a bit more time than simply, 24 hours. So I'm not sure what is the deal with that exactly. But assuming the autopsy is above board, then, that's obviously evidence to take into account here. But the point is the distrust of the criminal justice system, political system, etc., is so widespread and so deeply instilled that I think this is going to be just one of those instances where people just never trust the official explanation. They think that there were bigger powers at work that helped to create this suspicious death. And, I think that's at least a valid angle to approach this issue. I mean, one thing that I pointed out yesterday on Twitter is that if something like this took place in Russia, okay, so a oligarch, quote unquote, with, quote, connections to the ruling political elite of the country, was mysteriously found dead under circumstances that are, at the very least, highly dubious, then that would automatically get depicted as just another sign of the fundamental corruption at the heart of Russian society. And maybe that would be rightly so. But there's a aversion to applying that same kind of analysis to American society. So this will get depicted as some kind of aberration or some kind of, special circumstance, which maybe it is in a sense, but there's not going to be as much of an eagerness to portray it as cutting to the heart of American society and its kind of like latent and not so latent corruptions. So people should try to almost internationalize how their perception of how events like these are processed. If this happened in a place somewhere else in the world that is generally regarded to have failing or degraded institutions and is not responsive to the will of the people in a variety of respects, then I think there would be a lot of jumping to conclusions about what that actually signified in terms of the basic tenets of that society. But there's not really going to be that to the same extent anyway for this. Somebody says, imagine if a high-level Venezuelan was killed in this manner. Yeah, I mean, Venezuela obviously is undergoing some serious internal problems, and you have had people killed who are seen as dissidents or what have you. And then, the immediate reaction to that in the U.S. media is say, oh, Venezuela and its society is imploding. And they do have a lot of economic problems, but that same analysis doesn't get transferred domestically because people in the media and think tank world and all these elite strata, which basically comprise the opinion-making apparatus in the United States, have a vested interest in not believing that the United States is any way analogous to, quote, a failed state or a failing state, whether it be Venezuela or Russia or what have you. And that, I think, obscures often a clear-eyed assessment of what the meaning of events like this are. And I think if you talk to ordinary people, whether it be internet commenters who I'm looking at now or others, they probably would, for the most part, look at this through the prism of, wow, what does this say about just the very fundamental premises upon which the American criminal justice and penal system are predicated. There is a more of a deeply ingrained cynicism, I find, almost among regular folks in that respect than there is among the elites who obviously prosper and benefit from the way that American society is currently constituted, whereas people who have less of a stake in that sense tend to be a little more vocal and even disdainful in their just sort of overt cynicism on this stuff. All right, people. Thank you for joining my impromptu live stream, and I will do it again sometime shortly. Excuse the ambient noise. Nothing I can really do about that. I live in a bustling metropolis, so to say. Okay. Bye-bye.